sorry, didn't see you there. Oh, sorry, I was just trying to see if I could cultivate, but it seems like it is not meant to be, despite me being Chinese and having not seen a cultivator in my entire life. Yeah. So anyway, have you ever thought what it would be like to become a cultivator in a Wuxia world? To live in this beautiful world where you have an infinite amount of power with plot armor thicker than a goddamn bulletproof tank? Well, if you don't live in Asia and you're not Asian and you have not seen a cultivator in your entire life, it's very unlikely that you'll ever experience what Wuxia world is like in the real world. So the closest thing to that would be games. If you've ever played like a bunch of JRPGs or RPGs in general, I feel like if you went to your Steam page, every so often you'll randomly see one of these like Wuxia themed games that suddenly comes out. And the thing is, I've seen them so often that I started wondering what it's like, because as someone who has seen and read quite a few Wuxia stories, I always wondered what an Wuxia game would be like. And so this time, I played one. And it's not really that surprising. So the game I played is Wandering Sword, and is one of these Wuxia based games based off the Wuxia world and stuff. Plays like an RPG, and the combat is strategy turn based, but there's also real-time battle, but I won't talk into too much detail about the gameplay itself. Honestly speaking, because if I were to talk about the game in detail, the video would kind of take a bit long and I don't want to bore everyone with the details. So if you want to see how the gameplay is like and all the small mechanics about the game, I have a full review in the description below as usual, so you can check that out instead and see what my whole experience of the game and everything in it is like. But specifically for this review, I'll just talk about my feelings of a Wuxia game, as well as my thoughts on the story and in general my opinion of what happens when you make Wuxia into a game. And that's what this whole video is going to be about. So the truth is, very recently I haven't actually read that much Chinese manhwa or web novels, and specifically Wuxia stuff. I've mostly been going back to Japanese media, but there was a time where I did actually read quite a bunch, and the truth is that Wandering Sword doesn't actually feel that different from them in terms of story. So Wuxia series are generally based around the main idea of becoming infinitely stronger, having extremely thick plot armor, and permanently progressing in power. So in the game, you kind of can die, so there's not really exactly plot armor. And also, I actually managed to get a bad ending where I actually died in Wandering Sword, so you don't get the feeling of invincibility and knowing that you'll get out of everything perfectly fine. But if it's just the story section, you know that you'll never ever die in something. So there's that. But the only difference is that compared to normal RPGs where you can farm levels and get a bunch of stats, you can't really farm stats in a Wuxia based game because of the difference in power systems. While yes, you can still farm equipment and do crafting like normal life skills in other RPGs or MMORPGs or whatever RPGs, instead, stats in Wandering Sword, and I would assume most Wuxia based games would follow the more Wuxia based power system, which is through cultivation. So the stats in Wandering Sword are obtained off a skill based system which you can upgrade, and technically, while it is not exactly the same as just putting a stat point into strength, technically it's about as similar as you can think, except that you can get some additional unique perks from upgrading your Meridian tree, which is basically your stat tree. It's like a skill tree, but you only get stats from it, and every few nodes that you unlock, you'll be able to get a unique skill. So technically it's a skill tree and stat tree merged into one, but it's not really a skill tree because you don't really get active skills, but they're all passive skills. So yeah, you kind of get the point. If you've played enough RPGs, you kind of understand. But if you want to actually like have a clearer look at what I'm talking about, you can just check the review doc. I have screenshots of it. It should make more sense. But the thing is that with the way the game works, it actually is more balanced than your typical RPG, because the thing is that while in a typical RPG, if you are like stuck behind a boss or something, you can just power farm, and then somehow if you are willing to to farm like a certain amount of absurd hours, you can technically plow through the rest of the game with no issue, even though it might take extremely long. But the thing is that in Wandering Sword, you can't actually force progress your way through the game, because the way it works is that in order to get the points required to upgrade your stat tree, you actually need to unlock skills. And the thing is, skills are locked behind story. So without progressing in the story itself, you won't be able to power farm either way. So that's why, in a sense, I feel like it's more balanced, because you can't just cheat your way through everything after just like wasting an absurd amount of hours just farming levels. So that's one thing I actually quite enjoy about it. So the truth is, I don't actually have much issue with the game systems. I feel like they're actually pretty well thought out in general, and it was actually quite a fun experience to play the game. Not to mention that in the game, there are also certain compulsory fights with certain party members that you have to win in order to progress in the game. So as much as you want to ignore certain characters and continue using like newer, stronger characters, you actually have to pay attention to some of the older characters, since they are tied to the story and you can't just leave them and have them sit there and rot like a pile of dirt. However, this video is not going to be about the game itself, like I said before, and it's actually about the story. And the truth is that there's not really anything much to talk about with regards to the story. The truth is that if you've ever seen or read a Wuxia series, it's pretty much everything that you would expect. New characters that will appear in different plot points, part of crazy conspiracies that you have to fight, and then they'll appear again sometime, who knows how long in the future again, and then they'll become stronger, and then you realize that they're actually part of a even bigger conspiracy, and you have to fight them again, and then you get some random characters that appear once and then get killed off, and then they don't really end up becoming important anymore. It's exactly what you expect, because it's just a convoluted mess, and you can't really remember every character that ends up being important, because that's just the nature of how Wuxia writers work. So truthfully, all in all speaking, as much as you want to follow the main story, but due to the complexity and the amount of characters and the expected nature of how Wuxia stories are written, it becomes too complicated, or it becomes not engaging enough for you to want to follow, so it just ends up being a story that's there because it's there, but doesn't really end up engaging anyone at all. So furthermore, to add to that, a lot of the quest storylines are super expected, like I said before, in general, and they're also relatively boring. And the worst part about the story, I will say personally for me, is the last arc, because I know that the game was trying to bring together a major plot twist and bring back a bunch of characters and finally wrap the whole series up in like a huge major conspiracy that has been set up through the entire rest of the story before. But the truth is that it became super confusing, and it does not help that there are a few characters with extremely complicated backstories and identities that the truth is I have no idea who the hell they actually are. And so even if I want to follow the story and try and understand what the hell is actually happening, I have no idea what the hell is actually happening, because I don't know who the characters involved actually tie to each other in their relationship. So it's just not very fun, and it's very hard to engage with the story when you can't really follow it along very well. So I would say that this is not an issue with this game in particular. It's an issue with Wuxia in general, especially with how much I've read in terms of like Chinese fantasy. This problem is extremely prominent, so I guess you could say it's extremely expected of it, even though it's not good for the genre to say that it's extremely expected that it's not going to be good. So as usual, there's too many characters, too much long setup that takes absolutely forever to pay off, and then it simply becomes impossible to keep track of everything, because stuff that happened a million chapters ago suddenly occurs again a million chapters later, and somehow, wow, who have expected that after a million chapters you wouldn't be able to remember what the hell happened. So as much as I don't like Wuxia written stories in general, they are not really that well written, I think being formatted in the game actually makes it a bit more palatable, as it's not dragged out extremely long like certain Wuxia web novels you can drag out over thousands of chapters and end up even more complicated compared to a game which lasts about 20 to 30 hours for a single playthrough. So it's not as bad and egregious as it could be, but that doesn't mean it's good in any way. So yes, as much as the game is okay, I think it's carried too much by the gameplay and the feeling of wanting to be a Wuxia protagonist more than the story, because the story really has not really much redeeming points. Unless you just want to be extremely brain dead and you just really enjoy Wuxia in general and the whole idea of it, I would say that the story is not something to definitely be at awe at. So in the end, the game is actually pretty enjoyable, and despite my general dislike for RPGs in general, this wasn't actually that bad of an experience. Truthfully, I wasn't expecting that much of the game when I went in, especially after checking out the first 5 minutes, because I truthfully thought that it was just going to be some average brain rot Wuxia that you could read on like a web novel. But after playing the game itself for what it has to offer and the gameplay itself, it actually was decently enjoyable. There were definitely certain points where I definitely enjoyed myself more than I was expecting to, especially considering the impression I have of the game for the first 5 to 10 minutes. But there's definitely still a lot of room for improvement in games such as this, especially in the storytelling department. And I just hope that maybe for one time there will be a Wuxia writer who ends up writing a decent Wuxia series so that they can set the precedence for other Wuxia series coming after it to not actually have terrible story writing. But truth is, after playing Wandering Sword, actually I feel like Wuxia titles might actually be quite interesting, but I feel like also at the same time it's more like you can pick one of the very many different Wuxia games out there and they all probably play around the same way. So if you never tried a Wuxia game before, I would not exactly recommend anyone who enjoys games to play it. But if you have an interest in Wuxia or enjoy Wuxia and you've never played a Wuxia game before, I definitely say it's an interesting experience to feel what it's like to play in such a Wuxia game system, although the story might not be what people would enjoy. But it's definitely a very novel experience, especially trying it for the first time. Though I can only hope that in the future there might be a better Wuxia game that, while being good in terms of gameplay, also has at least some decent level story. So if that's it, I shall be going back into cultivation. I shall not see you guys for another video, and that is the end of this video. Until next time, goodbye.